Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. We have our second keynote speech of our summer school today. We're very happy to have here Brian Doherty from Keele University. I think this
environmental social movements in really across the full range. I did my PhD on Green parties. My most recent book was on Friends of the Earth International as an international network. But probably the strongest theme in my work has been working on radical environmentalism and on environmental protests. So that's what I'm talking about today. I am going to talk about Extinction Rebellion, but I'm putting Extinction Rebellion more towards the end, or not the end, but sort of in the second part of the talk, because I was wondering how precisely to approach this, and I think what I wanted to do, particularly because I've just read Lorenzo's brilliant book about movements, memory, and media. I wanted to think about something I've been thinking about for a little while, which is the place of tradition in understanding social movements. So what I've done is prepare a talk really around tradition as a concept and applied it to the case of direct action movements, primarily environmental movements in the UK. So the logic of this, as you can see, is that we get to Extinction Rebellion as a potential challenge within a UK direct action tradition. So there's a lot of quite interesting, quite intense debate going on in UK activist networks now about this kind of exciting new development of Extinction Rebellion as a form of environmental protest, and but also quite a lot of critical debate about the way in which Extinction Rebellion presents its strategy, and I think it's a really good case study for us of the way that movements develop collective strategy through conflict, through agonistic debate. So that's one of the themes that I want to stress. Lorenzo and I had a chat at the beginning about how long to talk, and what I plan to do is, because I saw the schedule, and originally it was like 2.5 hours. I think, oh wow, I've got to talk for like at least an hour and a half. But actually, as you know already, at the beginning of your early careers, academics can of course be given a 45 minutes and take an hour and a half. I don't want to torture you with that. I have plenty to say, but I'm happy to be flexible, and I'm also happy, of course, to take kind of if people want clarification during, just put your hand up and we'll ask. We can sort of talk about that. But I'm hoping that we can have a good discussion afterwards as well. The other kind of break I was going to give you from my voice was to show you a couple of YouTube clips. One of which is longer than you'd normally show on an occasion like this, but it's a really nice little clip of life inside Extinction Rebellion, focusing on the three of us, I think, here from Manchester, focusing on Extinction Rebellion Manchester. And my talk actually uses Manchester activists as the primary case study. So I think it fits really well. So that'll be sort of 3/4 of the way through. We'll have a little break maybe to watch that video. Okay, so this is the structure of the talk. I'm going to start by talking about the way we talk about tradition in social movement studies. And what I've done here is collect a bunch of statements where tradition gets referenced. I could have had about, 10 times as many statements as this. So we have all these different ways of referencing tradition, and kind of what's really struck me is that we talk about tradition all the time, and it might be because tradition is so elusive that we can't really get much further than this, but I found these various ways of talking about tradition. So we have Tilly and Taro here talking about tradition as in some ways constitutive of what social movements are. There we have two relatively local names. Donatella talking about using tradition as a way of explaining social movement actions. If anyone wants, by the way, I'm happy to share slides. So if you like, you don't. No, you're fine to do that. I'm just sort of thinking that we can make these slides available if you want them. So I'm not going to dwell on these. I just want to use these really to illustrate the variety of ways and the frequency with which tradition gets referenced. So Francesca Paletta talking about using tradition to explain activist ideas, tracing framing choices to long-standing and more recent political traditions. Then we've got, this is probably the most common usage of tradition, is to think about tradition as a kind of cultural constraint. So Jim Jasper talking about cultural traditions that even as we transform and attack them, we cannot escape them. So we've got this kind of, I think this is a very classic kind of statement of structure. And we usually, and it's one of those kind of slight paradoxes that we usually think of culture in the realm of agency, but increasingly we also think of culture in the realm of structure. And I think here we've got three statements really that at least talk about constraint, culture as a kind of constraint. It's there in a way that shapes and to some extent relatively determines the way that we do things. So for those of you doing any extra reading or any extra work, that's why I put some of these authors here, because they've all talked about tradition as almost a taken for granted element of the way that we think about social movements. And I thought I'd better get Lorenzo in. I think you probably talk about tradition quite a few times in the book, in the Movements in Memory and Media book. But I really liked, actually, and this is in a way, why the reason I chose that quote is because I really want to talk about the way that tradition is a source of conflict. So Lorenzo's saying, that in particular movement areas are seen as the bearers of heavy traditions and histories, the weight of which produces tensions and divisions in the movement. So I think, although in your book you're talking about student movements and student movements in the Italian context, I recognised in that, in a very different context, in the case of UK direct action movements, the ways in which thinking about tradition as in fact something that is fought over, and fought over through agonistic debates, is actually one way to get away from this rather static view of tradition, in which tradition is simply a constraint on our action. So that's the kind of background get us started. So why do we not talk more explicitly about tradition? And it might be, this is in some senses an experimental paper, it might be that actually we don't go much further than this. So I'm sort of testing out really with you guys whether we can do anything with this concept. So I'm really only at the beginning of thinking about how we might use tradition in a more systematic way. First of all, one possibility is that other cultural concepts do the work of tradition. So we have movement cultures, we have repertoires, we have collective identity, all of which tradition, when it's being referenced by those social movement theorists, they're always talking about one or another of those culturally based concepts. The other is in the absence of a kind of a very established understanding of what we mean by tradition. Of course, tradition becomes difficult to research. It has fuzzy boundaries. And of course, it requires longitudinal research. I think it requires longitudinal research anyway. And that's quite difficult to do, as I think I've looked at there are one or two papers, I think, talking about doing that kind of research. And that may be another reason. And of course, the most obvious might be that we always associate tradition with, both in sociology and in politics, we think of tradition as a domain, really, of conservatism. It's classic Weberian statement, for instance. There's a contrast between modern societies, traditional societies, and so on. And so we think of tradition as, in some senses, and if we go back to that idea of tradition as constraint, and social movements as progressive movements, it's perhaps not so surprising that may be another reason, I think, that tradition perhaps hasn't had the attention that it might have had. But I don't think that's the primary reason, because, as I showed at the beginning, tradition gets referenced all the time, so we can't escape it. So what should we do with it is I think, my question. So we have, of course, a very rich panoply of work on cultural inheritance. And if we start with the idea that tradition is about cultural inheritance over time, it's about the way that the past shapes the present, then of course, and this may be back to that point really about whether there are already work concepts that we use that, even if we're not calling them tradition, are doing the work of tradition. And I suppose the most obvious one would be Charles Tilly's approach to repertoire. So Tilly says, when he's talking about repertoires of contention, so talking about the various ways in which movement campaigns make claims in the public arena, repertoire of contention, I mean, he had many ways of phrasing it, of course, as I'm sure you know. But on this occasion, he says it's a cultural notion where you have collective learning going on through interaction, and you have the residues of the historical process of struggle showing up as constraint on how people relate to each other the next time that they make claims. But much as I'm a huge admirer of Tilly and the idea of repertoire, but I think what we've got there is a statement of the problem rather than a solution to it. So we've got the constraint element, and we've got the interaction is where you're going to find how tradition might be or repertoires will be reconfigured, and I suppose therefore to some extent traditions are reconfigured. Then more broadly, we've got this consensus that's well established now, a common sense, really, of thinking about social movements against the idea that they're created completely anew. That movements have, we know from the network-based analysis that movements usually come out of other movements, that there are chains of connection between precursors and contemporary movements. So that element, I think, is now well established in social movement studies. Then we have, I think, most of the way in which this topic gets understood is to think of it as a question of culture versus structure. Now, I've already said in some senses that that the way in which tradition gets referred to is culture as structure. So again, the existing kind of, the debate that was one of our few kind of, in social movement studies, I suppose our few really kind of strong internal arguments was this debate between Tilly and Tarot and Jasper and Goodwin in the early 2000s in the US, where Jasper and Goodwin attacked what they regarded as the overly structural analysis of Tilly and Tarot. And they put forward what they regarded as a more cultural kind of approach, which took more seriously movement cultures as themselves causal. But the difficulty with that argument is that of course, that Tarot and Tilly are also quite cultural. I was at a workshop recently where one of Tilly's PhD students, John Krinsky, was kind of responding to somebody talking about, not me on this occasion, talking about repertoires. And it happens so often that one of the exciting things in some ways about Tilly is that he's very, very flexible, and his views kept evolving. So John Krinsky's argument was that actually Tilly was much more culturalist than he's given credit for. And so I think we need to kind of try to move beyond the culture versus structure argument as represented in that Jaswin as being a kind of compound of Goodwin and Jasper, which was the kind of slightly conflictual way of Tilly and Tarot responding to the Jasper and Goodwin critique. So for both these approaches, as I've shown, I think, in the earlier quotes, for both the Jasper and the Tilly approach, culture is still a constraint. Traditions and culture are both constraints. And for both, I think, there's they focus on the way that that cultures change through strategic adaptation. So it's interaction with opponents or with other groups. And I think my own feeling is that the strategy literature, although it's evolved and changing in social movement studies, is still very focused on instrumental ways of thinking about strategy. And I know Lorenzo is certainly one of the exceptions to this, because Lorenzo certainly you in your book challenged the idea that we should. You can correct me later if I'm getting this wrong, but I think you recognised, I understood you as recognising the limits of what's ultimately, I think, is still a game theory, even in the way of thinking about strategy, even in the more culturally oriented theorists like Jim Jasper. I tried to illustrate why I think that's the case. So the first quote there is from where Jasper's talking about what he thinks about as strategy. Those of us who have engaged in activism, studied activism, would be very familiar with and recognise the texture of that first quote there about activist meetings. So much of our studying especially if you're interested in activist culture, you think about meetings, you're in meetings a lot, and I really like this quote from Jim Jasper. Anyone who's sat through endless meetings of a typical protest group knows how many decisions are made, and how much attention, disagreement, and struggle they entail. I believe that these choices must be the explananda for any theory of social movement strategy. And then that second quote, which talks about the creative moment. And the creative moment is when strategic players manage to break with expectations and make another choice, taking their opponents by surprise. This is how structures change after all. Now, I've got a slightly, it might be a pedantic kind of criticism, but I think phrasing as Jim Jasper, who's done such great work on culture and tactics, but he phrases things in terms of choices. So if you're familiar with his Taste in Tactics article, he says you've got one example would be, I think he gives 44 kind of examples of different tastes in tactics, but they're all choices, so they're all binary in some way, So one, a kind of classic example would be whether to be naughty or nice, whether to be confrontational or to try to engage in dialogue and with your opponent. And of course, we all recognise that. I think my feeling is that the first paragraph and the second paragraph don't connect as well as they should, because I don't think the way that activists make decisions is really about, and make those decisions collectively, really fits this kind of naughty versus nice binary choice. Because a choice, if you choose, in my understanding of choice, you choose from a fixed menu. So I would prefer us to think of this as decisions. Decisions are messier, but decisions have kind of, they allow us to connect the particular decision with the wider rationales and the wider issues in play in any kind of collective decision. I'll try and say a bit more about that when I talk about what I think, how I think we could begin to think about how tradition works. So I'll say a bit more about that a little in a moment. Dilemmas, everyone uses dilemmas, and I'm less confident about this, but I also have a similar sort of feeling about dilemmas. I think, I'm not quite sure how we should use the word, and even whether my understanding of dilemma is the same as everyone else's, and I realise there's a linguistic element to this too, because I don't know how dilemmas translates in other languages either. But I think, I'm going to give you an example later on, actually, of a conflict that's going on in the UK, which is quite distinctive, I think. And so perhaps I'll save that for later. But I've got a similar view about dilemmas to choices. I think dilemmas are also when we use that term, it's not always what we mean. I think we're actually talking about the kind of more agonistic process of weighing up multiple factors rather than the dilemma between one thing or another. So dilemmas and choices to me seem to be quite closely related. So if we don't talk about tradition much in social movements, where else can we find talk about tradition? Well, of course, there's lots of writing about tradition, especially in sociology. But the nearest I found to something that talked about tradition in the way that I wanted to think about it, and I thought was most useful for us as social movement scholars, was Mark Bevere and Rod Rhodes' work. They're British political scientists talking about traditions within politics. They have two ways of talking about tradition. They recognize this, that the first is the kind of, is a more ontological way of talking about tradition in the way that we can't escape it. So it's similar in some ways to the way in which we talk about tradition in social movement studies, that it's, insofar as there is no immaculate conception, that we're always working with the materials handed down to us from the past, it's an ontological condition. So there's a meta kind of element of the way in which the past shapes the present. But then on the other hand, what they're really interested in is particular traditions. So identifying traditions that are distinctive in some way from each other. And in the case of British politics, they talk about these four as Whig, Tory, Liberal and Socialist. And I won't elaborate on those because that's not really the subject of the talk, but it gives you an idea of, it's a way of situating discourses and practices of British politics as a kind of tradition that goes back at least into the 19th century. And as they say, traditions, what's interesting, I think, is that they're trying to focus on traditions as something that changes. So traditions not as static, but as in some ways dynamic. So traditions are not fixed entities people discover as already given. They are contingent entities people produce by their own activities. So they're adapted when people face new situations or new challenges. So there are similarities with our way of thinking about cultural inheritance in social movement theory. And there's this shared stress on change coming about as a result of agency in tackling, there's that word again, dilemmas. Now, it's important perhaps to recognize that the interpretive tradition or interpretive way of thinking in British political science has had plenty of critics. And I think the critics mostly have good points to make. So first of all, there's the classic social science one about what's your material here? So one point is to say, it looks as if Bevere and Rhodes they take at face value what anyone says about themselves in terms of their own self-understanding. So there's that rather basic, I suppose, social science point that we need to go beyond people's self-understanding and include other factors. Colin Hay has this, I think, this is the question that you will ask me, I guess. We need to know how traditions emerge and develop and what the mechanisms are. I'm hoping you've got the answers to that. And then we've got kind of the more structural analysis that says, okay, you can't just look at traditions as descriptive. You need to understand the way in which power shapes the context and the influence of ideas. So Alan Finlayson, very male debate this, says discourse and ideology are better than tradition. That's something we may want to come back and think about. The last criticism of Bevere and Rhodes is my own. Mark Bevere says something which I think takes this idea of tradition as evolving to a logical extreme. So he says, although we must be able to trace a historical line from the start of a tradition to its current finish, i.e. where it's at now, the developments introduced by its successive adherents might be such that the start and the finish have nothing in common apart from this temporal proximity. So the problem I have with that is I think it forgets content, because the reason Mark Bevere says this is he wants to say that traditions don't have any fixed content. And you can see the logic of the argument. If you want to say traditions change, then they shouldn't have any fixed content. But if you think of an example of a Marxist imagine a Marxian tradition that had completely rejected Marx. I just don't think that would make any sense. But that's logically implied, I think, in what Marc Bevere is saying. So I actually think that what the consequence of that is that we have to say either traditions die. They don't talk about traditions dying. It seems that they continually evolve. Because if they've moved that far away from their original content, we can't really talk about them as in terms of continuities. Now, there's a chance to mention Extinction Rebellion here. I think one of the interesting things about how different Extinction Rebellion is from the existing UK direct action tradition is whether we might see it as not within the tradition of UK direct action. So when we get to Extinction Rebellion, maybe think about, I'll try to summarize why it's controversial and maybe have a think about whether you think we should think of it as within the tradition, and I'll try to answer that, or whether you think in some senses it doesn't make sense to think of it in terms of the tradition. Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is my own summary then of the interpretive tradition. I do think it has value, this tradition, the interpretive tradition in British political science, in focusing our attention on cultural inheritance, and also, and perhaps I didn't stress this enough in talking positively about Bevere and Rhodes, the way they talk about the activity of meaning-making as in itself productive. But I think, as with the cultural approaches in social movements, agency is still somewhat opaque. And so my argument will be that it's the collective processes of dialogic debate in movements that we can take as our central focus for locating tradition and trying to understand the mechanisms through which it changes. Sorry, yeah. 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 Sure. Yeah, that's a really good point, because it means, I'm thinking of UK direct action tradition. So what I'm going to do is specify a UK direct action tradition, and and so the question I'll have for you is, I suppose, whether, having talked about it and then said where Extinction Rebellion is controversial, say whether that fits or not. Yeah, I mean, and this is one of the challenges, I think, because tradition can exist at multiple levels. We can have this very general senses of tradition, and I absolutely think that if we're going to use it, we are going to have to use it in a pluralist way. And that can be confusing, because sometimes you'll be talking about a particular tradition connected to evident within movement or movements. Okay. I finish on that one. I'm trying to think now. Yeah, I suppose just. I think in terms of understanding how tradition works, the best approach that we have so far is going to be drawing on mechanisms from the study of continuity and change in social movements. I'm going to say something about both memory and generations as the two areas. They're not mechanisms. Perhaps there are mechanisms associated with memory, but I'm going to say something about those in a while. But first, I want to say a little bit about what an activist tradition might be. So this is, in a way, another answer to your question, which is to say, first of all, I've chosen as a subject to illustrate what I think an activist tradition would be. Unsurprisingly, I've chosen an area that I'm most familiar with empirically. I'm calling it a direct action tradition, and what I'm talking about isn't connected really to a movement. So I've said at the end, it's a tradition rather than a movement. In a paper I published with Alex Plowes and Derek Wall, 2003, we talked about a direct action movement, because quite a lot of British activists at that time, although primarily identifying with environmental direct action, they talked about themselves not as an environmental movement, but as a direct action movement. And they still do. I was meeting an activist a couple of weeks ago, and we were planning a history workshop, and she talked about the direct action movement, and she corrected me when, she said, no, it's, this is the term that we should use. So at least within the UK context, that would work. And I recognise that it's really difficult then to say, are we talking about the same movement in other countries, where we might prefer autonomous, or we might... we've got, of course, the whole debate about new social movements, and I know I was reading, I don't know where Josh is, but I was reading Josh's paper, hi Josh, where you survey the problems or mention the problems as well, that, of course, about using that category. Horizontal, of course, during the global justice movement years became another well-established self-definition among activists. What I want to say, and I'll try to justify this as I go along, is that I think one of the benefits perhaps of thinking about using tradition is it might allow us to look at ways of acting, ways of debating that aren't actually tied to some of the challenges that we have in specifying movements as social movements empirically. So actually what we can have with traditions is ways of acting that are found across subsets of movements. So we can find a direct action tradition within movements rather than being a movement. So within global justice movements, within environmental movements, sometimes within various forms of radical feminism, we find elements of a direct action tradition. Then another point really about levels of analysis. I'm going to go quite local, and both local and national in the next stage of what I'm going to talk about, because obviously I'm going to be talking about the UK, and I'm going to talk, not to frighten Josh too much and Emily over there, but I'm going to talk about Manchester. So we know that the ways in which things are done reflect, because most of the time we're talking about relatively small groups of people. It makes sense that the kind of richer texture of activism reflects local particularities, local histories, and so tradition, used back to the more general use of tradition, it makes sense to think of tradition as having variations at local level. It also, I think, makes good sense to think about national differences. 15 or so years ago, we were all thinking about the ways in which things cut across national boundaries, the ways in which activist cultures, especially through the global justice movement, were about sharing practices and about communication across national boundaries. And of course, that still happens. And again, we could say, in relation to Extinction Rebellion, it begins in the UK, but they claim 350 groups in 50 countries within a few months. It's still really, I think, a very UK-based thing, but it's clearly had some attraction to some activists in other countries. So I'm not presenting this as a return to the national, excluding the transnational. But I think there's a lot of work now of comparative. Well, actually, it's not really comparative. I think what we've got is a lot of national case studies that show national differences. And I think actually, to some extent, the more we do comparative analysis, the more we find really interesting aspects of national traditions. And just to cite one example from work I did with Graham Hayes a few years ago, we were looking at anti-GM direct action, but we were basically looking at groups destroying crops. And we covered Belgium as well, but the strongest differences were between Britain and France. So Britain, Belgium, and France. And of course, in France, you had, broadly speaking, I mean, anyone who knows these cases well, we could talk about them in more detail if you want. But broadly speaking, you had the same target of action. So understood in terms of repertoires, we'd have something that was fundamentally similar. You go into a field of transgenic crops and you trash it. You destroy as much of the crop as you can. But the fundamental difference was that in France, you let the police know what you're doing. You have your identity card with you. You're part of a network called the Faucheurs Volontaires, who are organised to support you in the subsequent court actions. In the UK, there was a network that tried to do the same as in France. So they tried to do accountable actions. They were going to do, it was called genetic snowball. drew its heritage from the peace movement. But the predominant, they ended up being really small and significantly outnumbered by the people who preferred to go into the fields at night, destroy as much of the crop as possible, and escape. And they regarded that as more effective. They could destroy more of the crop. They didn't have to face the court trial. One of the reasons we felt this was different, you can talk about the actors, but the actors had enough overlap. They were similar kinds of people doing it in each country. But in France, the other interesting difference was when activists like the genetic snowball activists who did the accountable actions, when they faced trial, only happened a few times, but a few times they had a jury trial. This is another area of work I'm doing at the moment, which is on courts and criminal prosecutions of activists. So we're doing some current work on that, Graham Hayes and myself. But going back to the GM case, in the UK, the accountable activists facing a jury trial, there were on several occasions they were acquitted. On only one occasion did a jury convict, because they were being able to make their case to a jury, and even sometimes to a magistrate, so without a jury, the magistrates would sometimes acquit them too, recognizing the sincerity of their actions. In France, everyone was always convicted. There were a few occasions where the judge, because there was no jury, there were a few occasions where the judge would sometimes acquit on a technicality, but on each occasion, the acquittal was overturned on appeal and the activists were convicted. So the logic here is interesting, because in France, you do an open action, you wait to be arrested in the certainty that you're going to be convicted. In the UK, you go into the field and you don't take the chance of being arrested, because why make yourself accountable to a state that you think is acting wrongly? So even though you stand a good chance of being acquitted. So in the UK, you miss the chance that you have in France. In France, you can make a big theatre of the trial, and you can go with your tricolours, and you can call yourselves defenders of, they called it civic as opposed to civil disobedience, because they were defending the values of the Republic. In Britain, we don't have a Republican tradition. We don't have that to defend. We don't have a revolutionary tradition, even though, but those activists, had a stronger anarchist sensibility. And it was summed up by a Leeds Earth First pamphlet about this strategy, criticizing the open strategy of of genetic snowball, which, if you'll pardon my profanity, the title of the paper of the pamphlet was "Fuck the Civil, Let's Get Disobedient." And so I won't talk about the other example, because that would take too long, because that's okay. So what is this? This is where I get much more specific. So jump from the general to the particular. What do I think, if I was trying to characterize the tradition, the UK activist tradition, these are the things that I think represent what I'm talking about when I talk about these agonistic debates that go on within the direct action tradition. So it might be that I think some of this could apply in other contexts, but because I don't know empirically well enough some of the other contexts, I'm not going to try to say that this is a generalizable tradition outside the UK direct action context. So those 6 kind of areas of debate, we could look at those as dilemmas, because we could say, you've got, let's take the violence and non-violence one is a classic dilemma. We're familiar with that in lots of other kinds of movement contexts in other countries too. How much violence is justified, supported? We had, the whole question of whether you could criticize Black Bloc, for instance, or not in the global justice years. But actually, I think my point about the way these 6 areas of debate work is to say that they're generally co-present. I don't think an activist deciding what to do really approaches the question of violence and non-violence as very often, and certainly not a collective, doesn't tend to approach it very often as a dilemma. I think your predisposition in terms of strategy reflects something deeper about culture, about your broader view of politics. And the other thing is that the reason you might choose that, so let's say, for instance, if you take the first one, the opposition to representativity, the idea that you can only represent yourself, that you can't speak for others, that was one of the reasons why people who were radical but predisposed to non-violent ways of acting felt reluctant to criticize those they regarded as violent. And I'm not saying that Black Bloc were necessarily particularly violent either, because of course there's a moral economy of violence here anyway, in which nobody is really advocating in these networks what we would think of as traditional political violence. What we're saying, what Black Bloc was saying was that property damage, against certain kinds of targets was justifiable. The ones that probably need most explanation, I think, are probably the third and the fourth one. Outreach. I don't know if outreach is used in other countries in the same way, but it's used a lot in the UK. And outreach is code for saying we are a subculture. We need to connect to other groups, other social groups. How do we do that? And this is a perennial kind of subject for activists. They know that they're distinctive. They know that some aspects of their culture are off-putting. And so at various points, people engage in other kinds of strategies. And quite often, it's trying to connect with communities in deprived places. It might be things like, people's kitchens, providing free food. It might be language classes for migrants and so on. And that connects with that second, with the prefigurative practices and institutions. We're all familiar with prefiguration as an element of contemporary activist culture. But what I mean when I talk about the hedging challenge, and I take this, and this comes really from Luke Yates' really great thinking about work on the way we think about prefiguration as a concept, is Luke makes a good point, which is that the way in which this activist tradition thinks about prefiguration requires what he calls hedging. So you've got lots of things going on at any one time. So you've got migrant struggles, you've got environmental struggles, you've got a commitment to trying to work in a bottom-up way. You've got the question of, that final question about to what extent do you engage with positive initiatives from the state. And all of these have to be hedged, meaning they have to be combined. So you've got to try and deal with all of this together. And this is why I think, this is part of my argument about why rather than take these as analytically distinct dilemmas, I think if we regard that as necessary, I've done it. I've created as a heuristic device, these are things that happen in activist culture. So I've distinguished them. But what I really want to stress is that they're very often interacting. So we can't isolate one from the other. So usually what the position you take on one shapes the position that you take on another. And that's why I think it's hard to talk about it as a dilemma, as separate dilemmas. I think it's actually makes more sense to say, how do these various challenges interact? And so when you have to make a decision about what to be done, you have to take into account different positions on each of those kinds of questions. Right. I thought I should give you an example of a direct action defined organisation that doesn't fit. Sea Shepherd. I don't know if I guess you're probably familiar with Sea Shepherd. Organisation primarily known for harassing Japanese whaling ships, Russian, Norwegian, I think, whaling ships as well. But using the law as they see it, the international law of the seas, they regard themselves as within the law, enforcing the law. It's relatively well-funded for an activist group. It's relatively hierarchical, and I think people who are in Sea Shepherd, who are volunteers on the boats, they sometimes would have elements of the activist tradition, but when they're in Sea Shepherd, that has to be all put aside. the way that the boats have to work are traditional hierarchies. There's not, they don't sit around in a big circle making a consensus decision on what they're going to do. They have people in charge who make those decisions. And so Sea Shepherd, just because it does direct action, doesn't mean it's part of the direct action tradition, in my view. And that's not a criticism of Sea Shepherd. It's simply an analytical distinction. So I'm already, predictably, going way too slow. So I perhaps said I'm not going to take you through the history of this, but this is now getting on to the first case study. So we're beginning to get towards Extinction Rebellion. So we're looking really here at a list of kind of the background, really, of the UK environmental direct action movement. So these are the things that they did in very headline ways. Beginning in the early 1990s, the establishment of an Earth First group, in itself kind of interesting as an example of national variations, because Earth First, if you've read about US Earth First in the US was quite influenced by a kind of more nature-centered, deep ecology way of thinking, not in the UK. There was a little bit of that, but really that was quite a minority tradition. It was much more like the global justice movements of the 2000s, and parts of these networks fed into global justice. So by the end of the 1990s, it's really the UK environmental direct action movement through Reclaim the Streets, through Earth First groups, that's organising the anti-G8 big demos in Birmingham, the Carnival Against Capitalism in June 18th, 1999, and so on. So there's a fairly seamless kind of transition for these networks into global justice activism in the 2000s, although, of course, there is the challenge of activist turnover. So you get to some extent a change in personnel. And then we have really environmentally focused action hits a kind of crisis around 2010. So from 2006 to 2010, there were these national climate camps, which themselves were kind of distinctive and attracted activists from not just from the UK, but from across Europe, which we usually chose a symbolically important site to challenge causes, corporate and governmental causes of climate crisis. But the crisis, part of the crisis in the activist network was that there was a strategic loss of confidence in climate in these camps. You can't just keep doing the same thing with no obvious effect. And then, of course, there's this really interesting question of the revelations about the scale of undercover police operations within these networks. So British environmental direct action networks were, to an extent that surprised me, but surprised activists. There was a really significant undercover policing operation, and we know, there's a public inquiry now going on. It had to be fought for. The public inquiry will be a complete waste of time, but I guess you know about this story enough to know, the most egregious parts of this were, in particular, the sexual exploitation of female activists, primarily by male undercover police, who, some of whom had children by these female activists, and that understandably caused a crisis. But it's sort of interesting that it didn't kill the networks, didn't kill the movement. So I think in some senses this is still a wound that's being dealt with in these networks. And Extinction Rebellion comes in parallel to this, but from these networks. So we still have networks carrying on in much the same vein, like Reclaim the Power, carrying on much the same challenging, confrontational direct action. But I think in relatively, it's relatively small scale, alongside, of course, the other kinds of direct action carried out by groups like Greenpeace. And of course, there's a recruitment channel as well from the anarchistic environmental direct action networks into groups like Greenpeace as well. So some of the Greenpeace activists also have experience in more radical environmental direct action networks. So, Lorenzo, you're on the screen again here. So the things that terms of thinking about how we think about change, the two most promising avenues for thinking about this, I think, are the kind of work that Lorenzo's been doing about memory, and about recording change over time. So it's not simply and also the work that exists, and I really liked the article by Martin Portos about feminism and feminist struggles in Spain as well, about generations. So I won't talk in too much detail about Lorenzo's work because partly because I'll get it wrong. But I think in reading the work about the Italian student movement, I think one of the things, I was trying to apply it to the case study of environmental direct action in the UK. And there are all sorts of things I think, well, maybe that would work and maybe that wouldn't work. And I'm going to go back to the work that I've got planned for the autumn, which involves some follow-up biographical interviews with activists that I interviewed nearly 20 years ago, and a history workshop, which is a repeat of a history workshop that we did in 2002, with a lot of Lorenzo's work in mind. But I'm not so, I think that one of the challenges in the kind of turnover of these very biodegradable organizations is actually whether there are the same kind of events of historic significance that you can say are shared reference points. So whether the narratives exist in a way that's comparable to something like the Italian student movements is clear. And then the other really interesting concept, which I've been wondering about, is what I think, Lorenzo, you call movement areas, and they might, I'm not sure if this is right, but they could also be the kind of free spaces that Palazzo talks about. And sometimes they exist in the UK, and sometimes they don't. In the video that you'll see a building that isn't named, but which Emily and Josh at least will recognise as the Student Union in Manchester University Student Union. That's a building where Manchester Earth First had its first meetings, and you can see Extinction Rebellion meeting there. And you can see, before Manchester Earth First was formed, when I was doing my PhD in Manchester, I co-ran an independent left magazine, which had the not very original title of Manchester Left, and we worked in exactly the same rooms that you see there. So there are some ways in which you can perhaps find parallels in terms of the spaces that somehow carry on these traditions. But there are also the question of generations and the extent to which traditions are carried by particular people across generations. And I think, going back to the work that I did with Alex Plowes and Derek Wall on the Earth First generation in the late 90s and early 2000s, we found there was more evidence of generational breaks than continuities. And then the final point is about how you refer to history. And I think here tradition, if it means nothing else, I think tradition really ought to, one way in which we can find an empirical kind of basis for tradition is the way in which any group situates itself in relation to the past consciously. So what examples do you choose of who you think matter? And maybe it's something about the weakness of our lack of a revolutionary tradition in the UK. But what sort of struck me is that the reference points are usually really distant. So who are your heroes? And your heroes are very safe, really, ones that everyone might recognize. So I'll give you a couple of examples. This is a bit old now, but this is a group called Climate Rush. And the picture's a bit confusing, but they're basically saying they align themselves with the suffragettes, basically. So it's an environmental direct action group inspired by the suffragette movement, so the militant direct action movement to gain the vote for women. And we see it again, Greenham Common. We saw it referenced in the trial, a trial that I observed we observed the whole of this 9-week trial in autumn of last year, 3 of us working on it, of the Stansted 15 they blockaded a plane to prevent, a charter plane to prevent migrants being deported successfully, but they're convicted. And their defense lawyers referenced the suffragettes as part of the honorable tradition, as they put it, of civil disobedience in the UK. Here's more specifically Manchester, a couple of examples. This was the old Manchester Earth First newsletter, which they called the Loom Breaker, which was referencing the not suffragettes, the Luddites, who smashed the machines, who's written about in by E.P. Thompson in the History of the English-speaking working class. Then we have this one's not very good because I think it connotes this person's trying to say, well, peasants are more French, or I've got a peasant revolt banner, but this is a student activist in 2010. But one of my students, who's in Extinction Rebellion, showed me a picture on her phone of one I really want to get, which is a better example. It was a banner quoting Gerard Winstanley. And I don't know, has anyone ever heard of Gerard Winstanley? Yay! So you have to be British to know Winstanley. He was the he was a leader of a kind of communal sect called the Diggers in 1649. They occupied a piece of common land, and they're an important land rights reference point. An Extinction Rebellion protester had a quote from Gerard Winstanley, and I teach Gerard Winstanley to my students as one of several kind of heroes referenced within environmentalism. But look how distant these heroes are. Look how relatively safe they are. So look how history is being deployed. It's being deployed as a legitimator, absolutely. It makes sense to situate yourself historically in terms of cases that everyone recognizes. Okay, I think I'm going to fast forward a little bit because I'm worried that I will run out of time for the bit that you're probably more interested in, the Extinction Rebellion bit. I'll just talk very briefly about the next few slides then. This is connecting back to this question of how we think about continuity and change. The research that we did in the early 2000s in Manchester, and I actually brought a historical artifact with me. Not the original, but I can send it round so you can have a look at this, rather than me talk about it in any great detail. We were looking at the way in which within a city you can find, without groups sharing a name, you can find a continuity in activist practices, issues, ways of organising. So in Manchester, although Earth First creates itself as a new organisation in the early 2000s, actually, when you look at it, both here you can find pretty much the same way of organising, pretty much over the same issues, and even with the same infrastructure of an activist life present from the mid-1970s onwards. So I'll hand this, I don't know, Lorenzo, did you mind taking that around? This I'm handing around is photocopies that we did as part of our research. So this is, in a way, for those of you interested in historical documents, we did a kind of analysis of mentions of the places that we were looking at in activist newsletters. So it was also part of a kind of protest event survey that we did as well. So this is Peace News, which wasn't really just about the peace movement, and Peace News still exists. But in the mid-1970s, it had a special on Manchester. So in the photocopies that you've got there, we've had to go to the British Library to get the archive copies. You've got lots of articles about Manchester, but it shows that the issues, so you've got the women's movement, you've got gay rights, you've got migrant struggles, you've got local community politics, and so on. You've got the same things that Earth First is doing in the 2000s. You've got the same cafes, you've got the same ways of thinking about the challenges of outreach, and so on. And just to give one example, the point was, in terms of memory, none of this is remembered. So the activists in 2000, and this is, I think, this is the sort of interesting question and puzzle for me. The activists in 2000, if you look at the bottom two here, you look at Equinox and Birch Housing Co-ops. Equinox is a housing co-op that still exists on a street in a district of Manchester. To live in that housing co-op, you have to be an activist. So about 10 people live there. Manchester Earth First at one point had its meetings there, it had its archive there. It's a big house, big Victorian house. And on literally the same street, not way from the city centre, just an ordinary residential street, the 1970s through to the mid-1980s, that street was blockaded to stop, to manage traffic. Then there was the activists who lived in the vicinity lived in another house, but a house called Birch Housing Co-op. They established an activist bakery. Then that became a woman-only feminist bakery. Then that became a mobilizing site for Greenham support work. Now, the sort of interesting empirical dimension of this is, first of all, the Equinox activists living in the same street knew nothing about this. They didn't know the history of that street. Secondly, not the Equinox activists, but the activists involved heavily in the 1970s and 1980s all knew, because they were all still active. They all knew people who were involved in the 1990s. But they didn't know, the 1990s activists didn't know what the people had been doing in the 1970s and 1980s. So by the time the 1990s came around, they'd kind of retired from full-on direct action. So they were doing other kinds of campaigning. So one example was a guy who was then in his late 60s whose house had been very important for meetings, for activist meetings, and he was running something called the Vegan Organic Foundation. But he'd also, the first ever meeting of the Troops Out of Northern Ireland Committee was in his house. A British left magazine called Red Pepper had its first party in his house. And so the Earth Firsters knew this guy, but they didn't know all the things he'd been doing. And they didn't know he was a conscientious objector who went to jail in the 1950s, for instance. I don't know how they didn't know this. And another example would be a woman who had been the key organizer for Greenham Common Peace Camp support in the 1980s. And they knew, and the Earth First generation knew her, but they knew her as somebody who ran women's furniture making courses, not somebody who'd done Greenham support work. So this is why I'm stressing what we found were generational breaks more than generational continuities. So this is this guy I was talking about. This is him writing about the 1970s, and he's saying, he's talking, when he talks here about the International Socialists, that's the Trotskyist, that's what's now known as the Socialist Workers' Party, a Trotskyist party. He's basically saying we had a prefigurative politics. We felt that we needed to demonstrate through these institutional measures different ways of more satisfying ways of living and working. I'm going to pass that bit over. Now, we did sometimes find some continuity, and I know Lorenzo's done some work on this as well in terms of with Pris Gaddafi on generational continuities and discontinuities, and so in terms of global justice generations in Italy. And this was an example, I suppose, that's in some ways similar to some of the things that I think you found. So here we've got direct relational diffusion. We've got somebody referring to people who gave them advice about how to do things. So we found a bit of that. But I think it would be wrong not to also take account of the fact that somehow we've got this tradition manifested in these practices, or if you prefer to call it a repertoire, but we've got these continuities despite the lack of any institutional framework in one city. And I think we would find similar, I know we would find similar things because we did two other places, and we found it also in Oxford and in Bangor in North Wales. Despite really thin ties between activist cohorts and generations. And then you've got this, and I think this is, again, a familiar process. You've got this tendency to keep quiet, to recognize that your time is finished and it's time for a new generation. I don't know if that's a nice phrase. I don't know if you're familiar with mutton dressed as lamb, if you can translate what that means. Mutton is old sheep. And, so basically she's saying, they did things I didn't feel comfortable with, the New Earth Firsters in the early 1990s, rave music and so on. I felt I'd be mutton dressed as lamb. I didn't stop doing support, but felt that it was time to step back. So I think, I mean, for me, this still poses a kind of interesting empirical puzzle about how is this culture, as tradition, passed on, given the weakness of these ties, and this very evident process of separating yourself off from new cohorts and new generations. So we have two phrases here, which I think are really useful to think about in this context. One of which Christina Fleischer-von Menayer talks about, which is, I really love the phrase, strategic amnesia. She's talking about the M15 Indignados in Madrid, but she's basically saying people because the media was fascinated with the newness of the mobilization, the experienced activists just kept quiet about the fact that actually what was happening was, had plenty of precedence. And Lorenzo's term limited apostasy, that's very badly pronounced, apostasy, is a slightly different, I think, term, which basically means a conscious playing down of aspects of your politics in order to try to appeal to new groups. So Extinction Rebellion does that, I think. So I'll come back to that. So this is I'm not going to dwell on this very much either. This is a summary of of other work that talks about generationally specific, socially closed groups and the importance of friendship networks within the kinds of social movements that I'm talking about as part of the explanation as to why groups don't engage with each other. That groups have their own distinct culture, but they also have their own social networks, and certainly we found that too. But then we have this interesting case from Martin Portos of successful brokerage between feminist generations in Spain, and I found that really fascinating given the difficulties of this in the UK. And then, lo and behold, just as I was reading Martin's work, into my email box popped this really deep conflict between generations in the UK. You can't read this, but you could read it and give you the reference to it. This took place about 2 weeks, just over 2 to 3 weeks ago. And it's not an untypical incident of something that's happening in the activist networks in the UK at the moment. So basically what happened is that a very well-known activist called Helen Steele, she was one of two people who endured this major trial in the mid-1990s called the McLibel trial, where McDonald's prosecuted two activists for libeling them by giving out leaflets that were critical of McDonald's, and they fought this case really successfully, and it was a really important trial. Helen Steele was also one of the people exploited by as a female activist, exploited by a male undercover police officer who lived with her for some time. So she has a kind of significant status within these networks. But this was an action about land justice. So it was an occupation of a moorland site that should be open access by activists over a weekend with a protest camp. But there was a huge tension and controversy among some of the organisers, and I'm going to use this because it's a really super sensitive kind of argument in the UK, and I'm not going to give a normative kind of analysis of one side being right or wrong. What I think is important about this is to understand these kinds of conflicts as in some senses, and this is going back to Lorenzo's quote in a sense about the divisions that get created in movements, about these are the kind of crises which you can't really, I don't think you can phrase in terms of dilemmas, and certainly not in terms of choices. So some of the organisers of the Land Justice Action Network in this place near Leeds, Hebden Bridge in West Yorkshire, objected to the presence of Helen Steele because she had identified herself at various points supportive of radical feminists who were critical of some of the arguments made for trans rights. So they said to Helen Steele, you have to leave. And other people supported Helen Steele. So the letter here is from somebody who I know who was a Manchester activist. She authored the letter in support of Helen Steele. And then somebody else I know was one of the people who spoke to Helen Steele asking her to leave. So it's a hugely emotional argument, but what's sort of interesting for me is that the letter to support Helen Steele, which is basically saying Helen Steele is not a bigot, she is not a bigot against trans people, is signed by 440 people, and I recognize a lot of the names there, and they are mostly from the earlier generation. So we've got a generational conflict here over trans rights versus certain kinds of radical, a different kind of radical feminist tradition. And I guess some of you are familiar with the debates, around this issue. So I'm quoting it really as an example of generational conflict. Finally, we get to Extinction Rebellion. Okay, so you're going to get a break in a minute. I just want to say a little bit about Extinction Rebellion, the background to Extinction Rebellion, and also to mention that what I'm going to show you as well as the video, we've got some early results from a survey that Emily and I, along with 4 other people, did of... You haven't seen them yet, Emily. Only got them yesterday. A survey we did of the first day of the Extinction Rebellion, big protest in London. And I guess you all saw some of this on the news. So, and Emily tells me you've been talking a bit about Extinction Rebellion as well. So I haven't put much in terms of the detail of the survey, but it's piggybacks off the survey that I know Lorenzo was involved in. Maybe you were as well, Lorenzo. Okay, a few other people were of the children's climate strike. So we did one in Manchester. Claire Saunders did one in Truro in Cornwall. Of the children's climate strikes on March the 15th. So we decided we'd do one of Extinction Rebellion on the first day of their protest, April 15th. So the survey data that we've got is using the same survey that we did for the children's climate strikes. It's small, the response rate is quite small, but we have 101 responses, so it's kind of, you know, there were only 6 of us doing the survey too, so it's okay, I think. So the key events formed in spring 2018, and perhaps the first point is to say that this is people, the initiators and co-founders, as we would expect in classic terms, are experienced activists. So it's a spin-off movement from existing environmental direct action in the UK. Only a relatively small group, 5 or 6 people. And they consciously develop a different kind of strategy, and they develop of mass civil disobedience. They develop it because they think that the more countercultural anarchistic strategies associated with the UK direct action tradition are too limited, too off-putting, and they're not inclusive enough. People can't join in. You have to be prepared to do something quite challenging. So let's try and find something that people can join in. But also, and this is something you might want to talk about, also because one of the co-founders, a guy called Roger Hallam, we might be able to look at a little bit of Roger speaking, was a PhD student. And it's an interesting case of using his PhD for the movement. The challenge is, one of the challenges is that there are many things that, personally, I would think he's misusing. So if I was giving him kind of feedback on his PhD, I'd probably be quite critical. But what he's done is, but it also poses an interesting challenge to us as social movement scholars, because Roger Hallam is doing his PhD, and there's a lot of talk about Roger's research as the template for how Extinction Rebellion strategy works. The research, his approach to social movements is very much taken from Chernowith and Stefan and Popovich and others and Gene Sharp and their focus on non-violent action. So when you see the Extinction Rebellion actions, and if you listen to Roger Hallam talk about his thinking about the actions and the strategy, it's off the shelf, literally off the shelf. This is how we're going to create a rebellion. And even more intriguingly and fascinatingly, as a kind of way of using your PhD to change the world, it's to create a rebellion, in an established liberal democracy. But Chernowith and Stefan, I'm sure some of you have read Chernowith and Stefan, they analyzed these 323 cases to demonstrate the greater effectiveness and utility, greater success rate, essentially, of non-violent action relative to violent insurgencies. But all of the 323 cases are in authoritarian contexts. So the really interesting strategic challenge is, how do you take that and apply it in contexts like the UK? And the idea is you'd also do it in other countries too. So what Roger Hallam does, what he talks about, and I realize, actually, I think what I might do is just carry on and finish, because I realize we've talked quite a while. And what I'll do is send you the links so you can watch these other videos if you want. So I've got I'll try and do another 5 minutes or so, because I've started talking about the most controversial areas. So there's this question about the appropriateness, really, of that. But on the other hand, it's really worked so far. The question is, what next? So the next UK actions, interestingly, for us, those of us with the Manchester connections, are scheduled for Manchester. But I think the model, and he's very open about this, the model that's suggested is a much bigger action than in London sometime in the autumn. Because the idea is you do one action and then you come back and do a bigger action, and then the government gives way. And the government accepts what you want because you pose a dilemma, and he actually uses the word dilemma. He says it's a dilemma action. You make the government decide whether to repress you, and if they repress you and you're properly non-violent and disciplined, the political costs may be too high. Or if they leave you, you win by the fact that you're still able to do what you... And I probably already there are questions about how this really plays out in a liberal democracy already are occurring to you. The other examples cited are the civil rights movement in the USA. And all of us who studied social movements as students know a lot about the civil rights movement in the USA. And we also know that the civil rights movement did not win by going to Washington, D.C. twice and sitting down and blocking major intersections. You know, it required a deep culture in the churches, it required voter registration drives, it required a variety of tactics, it required a diversity of groups, and so on. This is a summary, you know, of the kind of the key principle. Strategic nonviolent direct action is a major system of resistance based upon the assumption that hierarchical systems can be modified or destroyed by withdrawal of submission, cooperation, and obedience. So this is, you know, it's weird in a way because it had relatively positive press coverage, but it's a rebellion. You know, it's a rebellion against the government. Those are the three, and this is the other interesting thing about the strategy. Instead of a complex multi-issue movement discourse, reduce things down to three simple goals. Tell the truth about climate change, make the government reduce carbon emissions to 0 by 2025, and then this third one, which is in some tension, I think, with the first two, which is replace Parliament with a citizens' assembly, chosen to represent the population, but chosen by sortition, by lot, so that they can manage the transition, because politicians are corrupt, they're vulnerable to lobbying for, you know, from fossil fuel industries and so on. That was the video that I realised I'm not going to show you, so I'll show you some of the data instead. We've got to cross-check this, but this is sort of interesting. We've got exactly the same percentage of women, of female, 64% female among our respondents. We had 64% among the climate strikers as well. That's something I think we need to reflect on, and it's really interesting to say that it's a predominantly, you know, female movement. You can recognise that I only got these yesterday. I have not been able to create nice tables, so it's simply screenshots from SPSS. Basically, I think it comes down to 13% of the people that we spoke. There was 8. But this is towards the end of the survey. So we started with 101 respondents. People got tired. I think we get down to about 80 people finished the whole thing. And but what you've got is super educated, unsurprisingly. You know, 13% have PhDs, 84% have degrees. I think we're now up to about 30% of the population in the UK have degrees. So even more highly educated than we're used to, even seeing among environmental activists. We see an interesting spread of ages, fairly good spread of ages. So it's this column here. Oh, I'm not showing it, it's not showing on the screen. But the valid percent is maybe the one to concentrate on. So you see perhaps slightly fewer retirees than the press. The press, I thought it was going to be, my sense of the day was it was more young people, students, plus retirees, the people with biographical availability, but actually you saw a kind of quite an interesting spread across the ages there. And this is sort of interesting, how much experience of protest, because the idea is, Extinction Rebellion strategy is to get new people involved. Well, first of all, certainly in terms of the educational profile, that's unrepresentative. We've also seen, I mean, I can also tell you that, unsurprisingly, you could have told me this, they're left-wing. They vote for the Green Party or the Labour Party. And there's quite a lot of people with a lot of experience of protest. So there's 20%, okay, we're only talking about 83 people, but 20% there reckoned, and I couldn't do this calculation for myself, I don't know if you could. You had the option to say, have you been on 21 or more protests? Well, I can't remember. I might plump for that. And then remember age. You know, the younger you are, you could still be quite a full-on activist, but maybe you haven't been on 21 demos yet or 21 protests. So you see quite a lot of experienced protesters. Then you see this semi-populist kind of self-presentation. So this is, you know, this is consistent, this way of doing your own signs. It's a thing we've noticed over recent years. But we asked, you see the two on the left, planet, not politics. I mean, that's fascinating to me. And so we asked them, we said, well, what do you mean by that? And in a way, reassuringly, what they mean by politics is parliamentary politics. We don't trust politicians. It's not that they don't think of what they're doing as political. Another feature of Extinction Rebellion is to return to some maybe 1980s peace movement ways of organising and have lots of trainings for non-violent direct action. And this has been really successful, I think, in getting some people, new people who hadn't done this kind of thing before, done road blockades, reassuring them. But it's also been really controversial because it may be that they're not actually presenting the risks of some of the arrests and jail in as clearly as perhaps they should, and that's certainly been a significant subject of controversy. I won't stay on this too much. I'm not sure if I believe this finding very much, but it is kind of interesting. I think it might be about the phrasing of the question. We use the same question that we use in the children's climate strike. So what we're saying is, have you done any direct action in the last 12 months? Well, we've got 83 people answering that, and 59 of them saying yes. Well, I mean, the thing that makes me think maybe we've asked the wrong question in the wrong way is they're kind of doing it as we ask them. So maybe it stands to reason. You know, we said it's the same as the children's climate strike. You take it home and you do it later, but online. But you know, maybe this. I'm not too sure about this finding, but it kind of could be remarkable when you compare the fact that if you ask that question to the general population, you get answers of 1 or 2%. I haven't talked about looking your grandchildren in the eye. I'm just going to mention intergenerational justice. This action on the left side of the screen is blood. You know, this use of blood is a kind of interesting symbolic metaphor. It was done in Paris as well in an Extinction Rebellion protest. The blood of our children. And it references the intergenerational justice argument within Extinction Rebellion. That's something interesting to discuss too. And I'm just going to put one of the areas of controversy, I suppose, is whether intergenerational justice deflects attention. And whether and also the question of deflects attention from injustices in the present, so relationships with the global south. And one criticism of Extinction Rebellion is that has come from environmental justice groups in the global south. A group called Wretched of the Earth wrote a critical letter saying that when you focus to Extinction Rebellion, saying when you focus on the science, you look past us. And somebody else has talked about Extinction Rebellion in terms of a methodological whiteness. I think the other point is to put Greta in there, is to say that, of course, I think Extinction Rebellion's success is in part connected to the success of the youth climate strikes. I think it gave older people a chance to do something in the UK. But that's not the only reason. And there's a kind of interesting question about the relationship between the two that we might want to talk about as well. So back to the tradition. Is it a challenge to the direct action tradition, this kind of radical tradition that I've talked about, all those 6 things that I talked about that I regard as constituting the tradition? There's clearly an example of limited apostasy, downplaying politics, downplaying prefiguration, and there's a stress on a universal moral message. The focus on its indirect action, the demand is for the government to act rather than acting to stop something bad directly. There's an explicit critique of an off-putting activist culture. Language is explicitly used to try to appeal beyond the left. Language like honour, duty, tradition. We might also think of that not only in terms of left-right terms, but also, and I don't know whether you agree with this, but whether there's a male quality to some of this language as well. And certainly nationalism. I mean, it's very odd for groups of this kind to be talking positively about nationalism, especially in the kind of transnational issues like in relation to climate change. Then there was an attempt to set up as an Extinction Rebellion business group with somebody who worked with Unilever joining in. This didn't last long because it was unsurprisingly controversial, even within Extinction Rebellion. So they said it was a misunderstanding, and now these groups were allowed to support Extinction Rebellion, but in a different way without calling themselves Extinction Rebellion. And then we love the police, chanting "We love the police" as you're being arrested. This is not how things are normally done. But is it really a challenge, or is it a variation within the tradition? Now, first of all, there are 10 organizing principles we'd recognize. You would recognize many of them: horizontal and anti-hierarchical organizing, decentralization, some of which produces chaotic ways of planning actions that are fairly familiar. There was criticism, including some from Joost and myself, publishing something online about the fact that they weren't really talking about justice. And I don't think it was us that did it, because lots of other people were it wasn't me and Joost that caused this, but there was, I think actually within these networks, I think there's a stronger commitment to principles of justice. These are left-wing activists. We've shown this through our survey. And so by the time you get to the April actions in London, you've got a much stronger emphasis on justice, decolonization, and so on. So on the one hand, you've got people like Roger Hallam trying to present things and frame things in a particular way, and he's written a book called Common Sense, a pamphlet called Common Sense for the 21st Century, which evokes Tom Paine's common sense from the late 18th century, and he talks about the people. And he talks a little bit about other groups who are clearly minorities, ethnic minorities. So there's the people on the one hand, and then there's the ethnic minorities. And of course, that is not how these things are normally talked about in left activist networks. But I don't think that, I think this is Roger speaking for Roger, not necessarily the culture of the network and the movement. So my expectation is that as Extinction Rebellion evolves, the tradition the things that are always there, as Lorenzo talks about, will actually come back more strongly. It's hard to say, that's a prediction, and it's very risky to predict things. And then another way of thinking about this is, I think, I found Paolo Giobardo's idea of left populism seemed relevant to some of the things that Extinction Rebellion do. So Paolo, if you've read, Citizen, The Mask and the Flag, talks about the way in which high visibility locations, public spaces, talking about the people. And of course, Extinction Rebellion are demanding a citizens' assembly. And I think there's lots in a way that reflects that wider cultural shift in post-2011 movements. So actually, I still think that we can understand Extinction Rebellion, it's clearly broken with elements of and tried consciously to break with elements of the direct action tradition, but it's still in other ways, I think, almost inevitably manifesting some of it. I'm sorry I broke my promise, and I'm going to stop there. That's me done, I think.
Thanks a lot, Brian, for the speech. We have some time. We have around 40 minutes for the Q&A, so I think we'll have the chance to have a good discussion. Who wants to start?
I've browbeaten you all into silence.
Josh?
Josh?
There was a bit about people, like for traditions to change, people have to be confronted with something new.
Yeah.
But can it not be that the tradition is changed by people doing something new in the face of a old problem?
Yeah, it's a good point. I'd be interested to know what other folks think. And just in the case of Extinction Rebellion, their sense is. So Roger Hallam, for instance, his sense is that he needs to critique existing activist culture, but his reason for that is specifically climate. It hasn't worked instrumentally, therefore we need to do things in a different way. So insofar as there's a crisis to confront with a rethinking of the tradition, that's how he would phrase it. But I think the point you're making, is an important one because it suggests leaving space for the creativity of groups to rethink their tradition. And I think if that's what you're implying, I think I agree.
Yeah, it's sort of when sort of people talk about like, oh, something has to change for people to adapt something.
Yeah.
It sort of takes the agency out of something, trying to talk about agency.
I think one of the other things is the internal and the external, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's to what extent are things happening elsewhere that, and one example. I mean, I already spoke too long, but there was loads of other stuff I could have talked about. But one thing I had in mind was the violence-non-violence debate. And if we think about how that's changed post 9/11, I think the strategies that advocate violence compared to strategies that advocated violence up until then, they must be affected, I think, by the context of a discourse about security, terrorism, and securitization. And so I haven't, I've concentrated internally, but I think there's scope, of course, to be thinking about external influences too that cause people to rethink traditions.
Hi, thanks again for your great presentation. I'm really interested in the movement as well. I just wanted to pick up on your last idea about populism, because you dropped it a couple of times.
Yeah.
With the slogan, Planet in Politics.
Yeah.
And then just at the end, so do you think Roger Hallam is a populist? Do you think Extinction Rebellion has a populist narrative? I'm battling with that question myself.
Yeah.
And two things that I think are very striking, but I want to hear you because you have obviously a much better understanding of the tradition.
Don't know.
Well,
go on. We'll see. We'll work it together.
It's the narrative on truth.
Yeah.
This whole truth-speaking, which I feel is something definitely that's in the air.
Yeah.
Whether it's Extinction Rebellion, Youth for Climate, and also across the board, politically speaking.
Yeah.
And the second element is linked to that is the criticism of mainstream media. And here I wanted to ask you whether this is something that has been used traditionally by direct action activists, or whether this is something specific to Extinction Rebellion. In particular, I saw some posts targeting specifically the BBC.
Okay.
And is this something new, basically?
Sure.
And sorry, last little question.
Yeah.
You said, describing Extinction Rebellion, Roger Hallam, criticizing the fact that he's doing his PhD and stuff, but saying it's really worked so far.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Okay.
How do you measure the fact that Extinction Rebellion has really worked so far?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
The danger is I'll go on too long now. Okay, so the first one. I don't want to talk about. I feel a bit mean talking about Roger personally, in that sense. But I think there is a. Yes, I really do think there's a kind of interesting populist narrative, and of course, in some senses, we're living in this populist moment where we're contesting and we're trying to make sense of the term populist itself, don't we? And that's an interesting subject of debate in itself. But I think if you read, if you're interested in this and you haven't already read it, there's a lot of Roger on YouTube, but there's also this Common Sense for the 21st Century pamphlet. And I think if you look at that pretty much gives you the material that you need. I think, just to give two or three kind of cases, I suppose, there is a lot of talk of, the word ordinary people is used. We're used to this, as populism from both the left and the right. The question you raised about truth, well, that's the other thing as social scientists, and maybe this is an indictment of us. We are right to be skeptical about simple truths. That's our job. One of the interesting things about Roger is he's not particularly skeptical. He talks about science. And he doesn't just mean science in terms of climate change science. He means the science of how to do a revolution. He actually says it, and he often uses the word empirical facts. It says this, and he says, which of course there are empirical facts, but he says, look, this isn't it. I mean, it's a thing, it's a contention usually, it's a theory that he's talking about rather than an empirical fact. Or he'll contrast the empirics with and this is in his writing as well, and he will, a lot of what we would think of as kind of open, contestable social science, he will refer to as degenerate postmodernism. So there's that way of phrasing it. Then the media one. Well, look, there's the two actions that they took, and it was interesting that the targets are friendly targets to some extent. So one of the first targets was Greenpeace. They occupied Greenpeace, tried to get Greenpeace to say we'll support the rebellion. Greenpeace, of course, was nice, but they didn't. And then the Guardian newspaper and the BBC, and the aim was to get them to declare a climate emergency. The Guardian has declared a climate emergency, the BBC hasn't, but at the same time, one of the things that helped the Extinction Rebellion protests in the first week was this interesting, in relation to the previous question, a documentary program called Climate Change: The Facts. And if we have somebody who's almost equivalent in status in terms of leadership, of a moral leadership to Greta Thunberg in the UK, it would be David Attenborough as a wildlife, and he made this program through the BBC, which basically was saying, look, climate change is a major, major threat, and that helped. So is it new? Look, what's sort of interesting is that there's less anarchistic countercultural criticism of the media than there was in, say, the 90s. I think there's been less in the 2000s as well, actually. There's a kind of recognition that the media does shape the public sphere, whereas around the time of indie media, around the time that Loombreaker thing was the idea was you create your own media, and we bypassed it because we can never get good coverage in the media, whereas actually some of these actions are designed also with the media in mind. So symbolically, absolutely they are media related actions as well as meant to be instrumentally effective. Work so far. Look, in terms of the textbook, this is what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to have. There was an opinion poll after the London actions, at the beginning of the London actions, where a majority of Londoners supported the action. That's quite, we're not used to that for the kinds of environmental direct action. It has had massively more attention, involved a much, I was thinking about it in terms of scale. Okay, only 6,000 people blocked the bridges in London in November. Probably, I don't know, it's very difficult to do the numbers for the London actions, but people stay for a long time, and maybe 10,000, but many more take part in some way or another because it's open. You can walk in and walk out and so on. So it's very difficult to estimate the numbers. On the other hand, you'd say compared to Spain, it's not like the 7 or 8 million people who got involved in assemblies and other kind of actions that came out of M15. So there isn't a deep culture. And one of my activist friends, who's a long-standing climate activist, his view is that there's no movement building. There's not enough movement building going on. There's too much focus on just having these challenges to the government. But at the same time, I think the movement will build its movement, and I think the tradition will still manifest itself. Not exactly as it was, but I think the weight of the tradition of how you do environmental direct action in the UK is too strong for it to be designed away. So I think if it works, it will work by changing the public debate. And what God, should we predict this? I kind of really, in some ways, if they did do if they achieved their second and their third demands, brilliant. But I don't see them successfully replacing parliamentary democracy with a citizens' assembly. So I don't think that bit will work. But on the other hand, I think it's been more successful than I would have predicted.
Thank you. That was a really cool talk. That definitely kind of relates to what my research is about, like zines and kind of connecting as direct action media. Okay. And I really liked your point about talking about the Sea Shepherd organization, how it has the kind of like it's direct action, maybe more about the aesthetics of direct action, but it wouldn't fit in within the tradition since it's very hierarchical, kind of based around Paul Watson as a celebrity god. Yeah. I wonder if this relates to like the challenge of the semantics of tradition. I'm mostly thinking about the Earth First in the United States context. Yeah. Because I've been involved to a limited extent with Earth First previously. And thinking about the word tradition, how Earth First, when it first started off, was like kind of like a very macho, male-centered organization, and it kind of eventually came out that a lot of those guys were very racist, didn't want immigrants coming to the United States because of like population type right-wing type ideas, and then the Earth First kind of like coalesced into a more intersectional anarchist kind of like by the 90s and 2000s. And I wonder if the word tradition, if there's like different ways of thinking, if there like different terminologies could be used, because I would probably still use the word tradition maybe, but maybe like thinking about like genealogies of discourse as maybe a different thing, because like tradition sometimes has a very like, in my view, almost like sometimes like a mechanistic way of thinking, like in the sense of like how it's a transfer of information from one generation to another, like almost whole like a whole piece of information, where there's like discourse would be more of like a fluid ideas that kind of trickle into the next generation, but they kind of adapt and alter to their understanding of the world. But yeah, overall, I really like this discussion. This
Thanks very much. I mean, I really appreciate that question. And I don't think I have a very convincing answer myself. I'm not convinced by my own answer to it yet. So I absolutely think that tradition requires genealogy. I think I'd probably feel that discourse won't be enough, because discourses are kind of everything that everyone says, and I think that has to be part of the subject, but practice too. So I think I'm interested in, say, the infrastructures, in the ways of organising, the things that people don't necessarily speak of discursively too. So I think, and one of the challenges is I'm making tradition therefore really broad, in the way that culture is really broad. But tradition at least has this, from the past to the present, so it has this temporal dimension, which culture, it has to begin somewhere, but it doesn't focus on time and continuity and change as much. But the changes within US Earth First would be an interesting example, because I think that would be, I would argue that it would be a challenge for me to say, how did that Dave Foreman-led, wilderness-focused discourse get displaced? And so the how it gets displaced would be interesting, but it would also be a good example of the way in which you've got a name for a network and a movement, but it's tradition. A new tradition displaces an older tradition, and perhaps perhaps there isn't really enough continuity, because they had those huge fallouts, didn't they, in the late 90s, where the more eco-fundamentalists like Dave Foreman left, when Judy Barry was was doing the kind of the timber trade organising and so on. So I think I would use that. My instinct is to say that's a good example of why we wouldn't say movements per se have a tradition that's continuous, but you can have cases where within a named group or network, one tradition displaces another.
A lot of people, Laurent.
Well, thanks, Brian. I think it was a great talk, also touching on topics that are now like on the age of those who like study social movements, and I particularly like. You mentioned tradition, but I would also refer to the historical past that should be brought in when we study even present movements and recognize how much has an impact on present situation. And there's an idea of taking this seriously, in your presentation. I'm not sure whether tradition and the historical dimension is something that found as a challenge to Jasper framework. I think also his more recent work, where he has taken the feedback by Olivier Filieux and Francesca Polletta criticism on his earlier work on strategy. I think he's moving in that direction. What I particularly find interesting in your talk is this idea about multiple dilemmas that influence each other, that is not present in Jim's work. But then I would ask you to tell us something more about this. Are there certain dynamics going on in this interaction? Are there certain dilemmas that are more important in triggering these dynamics? How much? I mean, you were mentioning, I think, a great example like 9/11 and the violent, non-violent dilemma there. That is probably we can make an example of a dilemma that was affected by the contest, and that triggered a certain number of further dilemmas in this interaction that you mentioned. So I wonder if you can tell us something more, because I think it is really interesting. Okay.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I read a couple of times that at the beginning there was a 2-year preparation, and that Extinction Rebellion was sort of as a campaign and not a movement. And I would like to know more about that, and I would like to know more about, do you know if there was any mention of other groups of action or actions during the preparation stages?
Okay.
And my other questions is about the links with other groups and especially Reclaim the Power.
Yeah, okay.
Hi, thanks. A lot of food for thought, for sure. Just a small note on the populist thing that we were talking about. It's interesting that Salvini uses the exact same comments. We talked about a Europe towards a Europe of common sense. So it's interesting that very different groups are using the same, and Podemos uses it well. So it's interesting that a lot of different groups are using the same terms. In the first part of your presentation, you talk about this kind of lineage of groups, of environmental groups, and how they have kind of the same practice and repertoires. And I was thinking about my own work in Spain, about the 15M, and how they have also this idea that they are spontaneous, or at least they sell themselves like that, right? But then when I look back, and I think Lorenzo's work speaks a bit to that as well, when I look back, there is a lot of, a lot of the stuff they do was already in the 70s and the 60s and so on, was present in the workers' movement. So I was thinking if you go outside the environmental movement, if you work to the workers' movement in the UK, if you find something similar as well.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, great questions. So, Lorenzo, I mean, there's these great scholars who I need to read Jim's more recent work, because the most of what I've been working on with him has been since he's been doing the players and arenas, So I'll need to get those references from you. But it sounds like that's really important to find out what Olivier and Francesca Polletta have been saying. The point about dynamics and dilemmas, you're right. I mean, this. I think my nearest excuse, I suppose, is that I need to do things like this to get questions like that to know how to think to develop it. But I mean, I can think of a kind of example I've been puzzling over slightly where we might look at change. But it's also relates to what people have been saying about doing genealogy and how we might do genealogies inside and outside. So I really like, and obviously, you know, it's dangerous for me thinking about political violence with you here, but the 9/11 kind of, and the way in which that some dilemmas can be more important than others, and that we could process trace potentially, you know, how dilemmas have these kinds of effects would be interesting. But another aspect of change that intrigues me, which already, say, Francesca Paletta has done work on. She did that great book, you know, with the brilliant title, Freedom is an Endless Meeting, about the way in which the meaning of consensus democracy changes in different movements and over time. One of the things I noticed in that, the Peace News, and they're kind of, not in the edition that I was showing you, but when we were reading about Peace News, we found these things about the ways in which you organize, which kind of made me think, a little bit like, say, Francesca found when she was doing consensus decision-making. There were ways in which people thought they could organize and solve the problem through their organizational principles. So an example was given of women who wanted to meet separately from men in a kind of a third world solidarity shop in Oxford in the mid-1970s. And these men who were outraged, you know, saying, why can't we all meet together and resolve our problems together? And it was kind of before separatist feminism and women-only spaces had really become established. But it made me think that there's in similar way to Francesca Paletta talking about the way in which consensus decision-making moves towards a less perfectionist way of thinking about decisions. There may also be other process traceable, but it'd be really hard to do, wouldn't it? Process traceable evolutions like this, because this sort of this self-criticism and crisis around in these kinds of examples in the 1970s. About what were they getting wrong, why were they doing it wrong. Surely they could come up with a design that would be right, that would solve all of these problems. I think the kind of accumulations and mutations of experience since then have changed things. So I think that's the kind of thing I would try to do in response to your question. Then the 2-year campaign. I think at the moment it's a campaign. I mean, we know what I would go with the kind of more, I suppose, the fairly straightforward way of saying that at the moment it's a campaign, but it's also a spin-off movement that's developing movement structures. So there are groups now organising with regular meetings that's going to sustain itself over a period of time. I think it's moving towards being a movement. But you know, it depends how we define movement, doesn't it? The 2 years. It's not. If I said 2 years, I was wrong. It's less than that. You know, it's about a year since they first had the idea. And I went to a meeting before the November London actions. I went to a meeting in London, which Roger Hallam and Gail Bradbrook and all the founders were there, and there was only about 50 or 60 people. That was back in the end of September, and things felt really new, and you know, nothing much was happening at that point. So I'm not, you know, I think it's actually much quicker, and the speed of it is kind of interesting that it's worked so quickly. And one of the people give credit to Roger Hallam personally, and I think probably rightly, for going to endless meetings. He goes, you know, and he gives his talk about climate crisis and rebellion, and he goes not to normal activist places, but he goes to small towns and gets people involved, and he literally at the end of the meeting you sign up to say, are you willing to be arrested and go to jail? And I think, you know, I mean, it's odd because it's so simple, but it's certainly new people have been encouraged to get involved because of that process. Now, relationships with other groups, there's a friendly tension. I notice, you know, Extinction Rebellion's newsletters say positive things about other groups and things that they're doing. Reclaim the Power, people that I talked to, I don't know precisely, they were initially a bit suspicious. some of the Stansted defendants, when Extinction Rebellion was kicking off, they're also mostly environmental activists, although they were doing a migrants' rights action. I remember one of them saying to me, well, they've got no prefigurative politics about Extinction Rebellion. So I think here's the thing that struck me. Emily was at this meeting as well. After the London actions, that big meeting in Manchester, I've not seen a direct action focused meeting as big as that in Manchester in all the time I've been looking. 250 people squeezed into this room. I didn't recognize anyone from the previous activist generations. The only person, there's one person who is very, he goes to everything but he was there to observe as much as anything else. So that tells you something, I think, about the breaks, and it's another example of the break. But at the same time, as part of the trial observations, I went to the first Extinction Rebellion trial of people who took action in Manchester a month or so ago. It was a complete farce as a trial, had to be suspended, and now it's coming back in September. But I spent 2 days with the very bored 8 defendants, and it was really good. And they are the people who appear in this film that I never showed you, but I can circulate the links. And what was sort of interesting, of course, in the process of hanging out with them, is there's a mix of a few of them were really new, but a few of them were experienced activists. They were all really critical of this "we love the police" discourse. There were also folks and they clearly had a broader prefigurative politics, and they were mostly very young. And so this is why I think that, my feeling about that Manchester meeting, Emily, as well, is that it was young people, wasn't it? I mean, it was overwhelmingly young, that meeting. And so I think this is like what happens in these moments of, big mobilization is the new activists come in, and then the tradition is the context in which they learn about the debates about how to do things. So I don't think it's actually, I think there's actually, the tradition is more powerful. And in some ways, unfortunately for Extinction Rebellion, it's not, although there are people who wouldn't otherwise have been involved, it's much like the peace movement in the 1980s. There is a broader kind of range of people of broader generations than the direct action young core. And that's a credit to them because they've done these soft actions that are easier to take part in. But I worry too that when the government begins to change and changes the law, the police already campaigned publicly for the government to change the law to have stiffer penalties against non-violent protesters. That was the chief of the Metropolitan Police went public saying, we need tougher laws. And you worry then what will happen to the people who don't have so much activist experience.
I have a question. You mentioned the gender, that there are more women. Yeah. But I find it, I know Extinction Rebellion a bit, from there, also in Switzerland, there are some groups, new groups. But from what you talk, they're mainly men that are the leading figures in this movement. I don't know, maybe it's not the case. And the question that I'm asking myself, because in Switzerland I can also see this discourse that patriarchy is the problem and that we need to fight this in the climate, also in the climate movement, and that this has been used as an explanation why there are more women in those movements. And actually, just as a comment, in Switzerland there's going to be a feminist strike, and the two movements are also kind of joining to say we have common claims and we fight for the same thing.
Right.
So I just wanted to know if
that's really interesting. Yeah. Well, you see, I don't know much about how Extinction Rebellion is playing out in other countries, because that hasn't happened in the UK yet. And it seems to me that Extinction Rebellion, in the same way that, say, the label of US Earth First and certain kinds of practices, when it came to the UK, people called themselves Earth First, but there was a huge cultural difference between them and American activists when the American activists came in the 90s. So if if what happens in Switzerland, you know, is you get cross-movement alliances, to me that makes more sense. I mean, one of the other kind of points that other activists make about Extinction Rebellion is the reason we're kind of confused and ambivalent, I suppose, about it is that those three simple demands they're easy to communicate, but they also, in certain senses, depoliticizing, because you know, if the only function of the Citizens' Assembly is to govern the transition through a climate emergency, the problem is that the choices and decisions that have to be made around who wins and who loses, and also how do we, in our one countries, you know, this is the other thing, where's the transnational level? How do we negotiate the transnational level? And so there isn't a sort of sense of what society are we trying to create. There's just, we've got to deal with the climate emergency.
Yeah?
Ask a question. And I'm trying to jump in a few things, because I think these things you were just mentioning relate a lot with the general framework of your talk about the relationship between this mobilization and a certain protest tradition. Because at least, and we were already discussing partially this a few years ago during Jos talk, it seems like what's happening to the environmental movement is very similar, at least from my point of view, to what has happened to different kinds of movement in the last few years. And all this reminds me a lot of the 15M in Spain. Yeah. Okay, the idea of novelty, and the idea of downplaying the complexity of certain politics and the partisan nature of it in order to broaden the eventual constituency and the audience of it, and choosing reach over identity. Okay, and this is really something. And at a certain point, I think, and Tiago was also was partially aiming at that many of us have been stressing the continuities between the anti-austerity mobilization and previous mobilizations, because we were partially debunking the myth of the spontaneity of movements. But it does not mean that there wasn't an element of novelty there. Okay, and this is interesting because it's coherent with everything you said about the research on memory and traditions, etc. That movements have this need to look novel in order to escape rituality. And I think that at the core of every episode of collective action, there is the need to reproduce a feeling, a message of exceptionality. What we're saying is really important, especially in movements that are characterized by a certain rituality, okay, that become almost seasonal. Like in my case, it was the student movement, but I think environmental movement from this point of view is very similar, okay, that sure, there have been environmental mobilization for a long time, and people are used to that. How do we convey the idea that this time is different, that what we are aiming at is really important, it's exceptional. And this whole narrative of the emergency, from my point of view, is really connected to that. This is not the usual thing, this is an emergency. So we need to do something extraordinary because this is needed to convey exceptionality. And many times, and you mentioned Francesca Spoletta's work, and she's talked a lot about the debate on the repertoire of violence, the repertoire of contention, and especially violence as a metonymy for radicality, but also for exceptionality, to attract attention and so on. And they're trying to do this in a different way because there is also this populist element of, which is not obviously completely new, because in the G8 in Geneva 2001, people were chanting, "Your G8, we're 6 billion." This was already, you know, populist elements are always there in movements. But sure, I think we are in a populist moment, so this shows more. And So I think there is element of continuity, but also novelty and strategizing over a construction novelty in order to convey exceptionality, which is really crucial, and it makes so that the case of Extinction Rebellion is really important for all the things you said on traditions.
Yeah, thanks. Diego, hi. I never answered your question before, so I'll try to answer it now alongside Lorenzo's. I mean, I completely agree, so I won't repeat what you've just said. I think the only thing is in some ways, one of the things that strikes me about Extinction Rebellion is it's almost partly because of the relative simplicity of the structure and the message, it often fits things that I kind of tended to think I wanted to challenge about some aspects of social movement theory. So it's really self-consciously strategic. So insofar as we don't normally have people like Roger Hallam who are writing these texts, telling us exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it, it's easier to study. I mean, it's like straight Snow and Benford in some ways about framing, because it's saying, but at the same time, of course, there is, I think, a sincere and authentic kind of response which goes beyond Extinction Rebellion. It's not like they've created the sense of climate emergency, and this is why the climate strikes are also mutually reinforcing. Now, this bigger question about, the questions you both raised about populism and about continuities and about finding similarities, as you said, Diego, in other places. So the same practices, of course, might exist in the workers' movement, for instance. I think I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the things. Perhaps one thing when you're doing the genealogies, so the historical kind of comparative work, is that I quoted in one of the slides there, I quoted the Manchester activist who's now in his 80s, talking about what they did in the 1970s as distinguishing themselves from the International Socialists, who are now the Socialist Workers' Party. And I think, so on the one hand, what you've got is this conscious. This is a collective identity self-understanding, isn't it? This is what we think that we do that makes us different from you. But I suppose what I take partly from your question is that we shouldn't take for granted that one-sided self-understanding about practice is exactly the truth. So what we should be doing is looking where we can to mess that up. And I think I can't go on too long about it, but I can think of some interesting examples in the things that we found in history that fit the suggestions that you're making. And one, so just to identify the area, one of would be the way that workers' cooperatives worked within activist networks, and that you could find the kind of conflicts that you're talking about going within a self-consciously left and trade union tradition, is how we'd phrase it in the UK, and a more anarchist-influenced tradition. And Salvini, yeah. I don't think Roger Hallam is saying the same thing. I think he's a left populist, but he also uses words like liberal universalism. The problem is, as a kind of academic studying these things, we have to engage in critical debate, but we also, in the UK at least, it would not be well received, I think, if we used our academic credentials to say, actually, I think you're misunderstanding the liberal tradition. And so I think, and it's an interesting challenge again for you guys, I think, and certainly some of us in the room, but when we have opportunities to talk to activists, how we do it. So one of the things that we're going to do, I talked about history workshops, and we'll talk about that a bit more this afternoon. One of the reasons I'm organising another history workshop in Manchester is because it worked so well as a kind of intervention to allow people to share experiences, much like Josh is talking about in his paper. But the Extinction Rebellion activists that I spoke to around the court trial, they're really keen to come and learn and talk to other activist generations. And I think maybe one of the ways in which we can assist the self-understanding of tradition amongst activists is by creating these kinds of dialogues. But you have, certainly in the UK, you have to do it sensitively because there's quite a lot of skepticism about the value of kind of academic research on these questions. We may have had enough.
The simplicities of the 1, 2, 3 objectives.
Yeah.
Do you think this could actually run the risk of really raising expectations too much about within the movement as to whether this is actually enough, and that inevitably it's going to run into real politics, and inevitably this could like significantly backfire against Extinction Rebellion?
Yes. I mean, my short answer is yes. Wait a second. Okay.
Thank you very much for your talk. Trying to be quick, I've got a lot of potential questions, but I try to be limited. It's related to the last point, and because I'm working on the environmental movements in Italy, specifically about territorial movements, so a lot of the things that you mentioned resonated a lot with my work, but I wanted to ask you, because the first 2 points of the 3 key points of the Extinction Rebellion are very reflects a lot of the tradition of lobbyist activities, in the sense that there is a demand. So in my interviews with the Italian activists coming from radical territorial movement, there is always this claim of combining more contentious activities with lobbyist institutional. Is there the same pattern also in the Extinction Rebellion? This was the first question. The last one, then maybe we can discuss privately my other doubts, is a curiosity that I've got, but it is related to the framing of Extinction Rebellion. Can you specify why the name Extinction Rebellion? In the sense that I totally get the rebellion, it makes totally sense, but the concept of extinction, it seems that goes in the opposite direction of the 2 first points, in the sense that we put trust in governments, so in the action of human beings and human institutions, and it doesn't sound to me as a claim for extinction, but for the role of humanity.
Josh,
Just a really quick question. I just wanted to ask, sort of with reference to traditions, whether you'd read Kevin Gillen's article on vectors.
Yeah,
so I thought that was
really good.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting way to sort of see a more fragmented way.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. I might say something about it.
And thanks for that, Brian. I mean, I'm sure we can talk about this in more detail later, but a couple of things that struck me about the, in like considering the repertoires and hearing your presentation about Extinction Rebellion, I think one thing that wasn't really mentioned was potentially the implications for how Extinction Rebellion have been using social media in this mobilisation, and how that perhaps, because of technological advancements, is a move away from past tactics, and perhaps the impact that has had on their ability to mobilise and kind of gain traction as they have. And also I was thinking about potentially, in hearing you speak about memory and this kind of collective memory, of kind of, are there parallels between perhaps previous notions of like contraction and expansion within environmental movements of the past. And that's because I think it's quite interesting that Extinction Rebellion seem to speak of them. They actually publicise that language and saying, oh, we're having this moment of mobilisation, now we're going to go and kind of consolidate and contract and think, and then we're going to go back, and it seems to be that they treat them, almost describe themselves as this living organism that's never going to end, that it's just building momentum. So I was just wondering, perhaps either in the language of how that's being spoken about, or if in how actually that might play out, if that draws on any movement of the past.
Yeah. I might do the thing of working backwards, so starting with Emily's. The social media point's a good one. I don't have a real answer to that. I mean, it's partly generational, so I am on Facebook, but I hardly ever use it, and Twitter, Instagram. Okay, yeah. See, that's my generational, failure, isn't it? So, I mean, it struck me. I was interested in this trial. It was really difficult to find out. It was the first trial of people arrested and prosecuted for Extinction Rebellion protests in Manchester. And it was only because I went to that meeting that I knew that there was definitely. So it's maybe I'm just on the wrong social media, but it wasn't. It was clear also. It struck me as somebody interested in trials and the significance of trials for activists and activist culture, how low key it was. It's almost like it's being downplayed as it's not that important. And it's the same thing with. They had a pamphlet, which then had to be withdrawn. And I kid you not, you've heard about it, about going to jail and how fun it was potentially, and it's you can do yoga, and it's the aim was to make it seem less scary, but and it took no account of the fact that it's not the same if you're trans or if you're black, if you're disabled, and so on. So there's that. The contraction and expansion. Well, look, I'm interested to see how much, because it's a decentralized model, how much local groups take control of their own agency and action. So the fact that we've got this big now few days of action in Manchester, I hope that was a Manchester-decided thing. Because, again, if you listen to Roger, he sets this out in a very mechanistic way. You do an action, and you get... I mean, he literally uses this language. He says, we now know if we get 1,000 arrests, it's a meeting with... And this is partly your point, Niccolo. So they got a meeting with senior politicians, including the minister with responsibility for the environment. And so they said 1,000 arrests equals a meeting with Michael Gove. 10,000 arrests could equal a meeting with the Prime Minister, whoever that will be by then. And then it was also, you do one action, you go back and do community actions, and you try and build support for the next big action, but the next big action must be bigger. Well, look, in 1961, in Britain, we had mobilisation in very similar vein, where there were actually more people arrested in one day than in the London Week. So in the anti-nuclear protests, and it was called the Committee of 100, and the idea was to be arrested and fill the jails, and it was inspired in part by US civil rights activism. So they said, okay, well, this was huge. We did this in London, and then we're going to go to a big US base, and this time we're going to have, instead of 10,000 people, we're going to have 50,000. Well, they got 10,000, and they had 700 people arrested on the second action, but, and this relates to your issue of disappointment, the movement collapsed because it was seen as a disappointment. They failed to meet their promise. And this is the danger, I think, if you set out a mechanistic plan in this way, that you raise expectations which are then disappointed. Then, Nicola, your point about the mixture of contention and lobbying. Well, I've got to give a talk at Friends of the Earth, UK, about Extinction Rebellion in a couple of weeks' time, so they're really interested. And of course they're supportive, but they're also feeling slightly targeted. There absolutely isn't an infrastructure to do lobbying like is normally done by institutionalized environmental groups. There is no culture really of being able to engage in, for instance, reformist legislation. That's not the intention. But at the same time, because the model is these anti-authoritarian people power rebellions, and then sometimes it's also the civil rights movement in the USA, the idea is that you create a crisis by showing your moral superiority using strict code of nonviolence, and that gets you into the negotiating position. But at the same time, if you're a negotiator, and this is again quoting from Roger Hallam on Common Sense, he says, we will accept no compromises from the corrupt political elite. So how do you negotiate when you say that? So it's not really, it's very much a contentious, challenging strategy, not a mix of the lobbying, but at the same time, in certain senses, it's indirect action because it's asking the government to act exactly as you said, rather than direct action to change bad things happening, which is the more pure form of anarchistic direct action. We can talk about Kevin's work later. I kind of scribbled down questions. Have I forgotten anyone's? Oh, yes, okay. So there is something to be said there. This meeting that I went to back in September, they had a really interesting debate about that. Not because that wasn't when they formed the name. I don't know when they chose the name. I don't have enough knowledge really to answer that properly. But I think, first, I mean, rebellion itself is odd enough in a liberal democracy. The idea that they say the government has broken its contract with the people. And it says the government is failing to fulfill its primary functions to protect us against the climate emergency. So that's the rebellion. And I've even seen slides that put up Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, as kind of political theory ways of justifying this. And then, but the extinction, you have to read some of their literature a little bit, I suppose, but it's climate emergency. But it's the time when they did the London actions was also the time when WWF released their Living Planet report, and there's a lot of talk alongside, impacts on human society of species loss. So the 6th great mass extinction, and one of the things that I remember one person being very strong in this meeting in September, saying, too much of Extinction Rebellion is talking about the impacts on people. What about the impacts on other living things? And I think you see that, and I think that's come through. There's a kind of that's the broader environmental commitment that I think is appealing to a lot of people, and to me as well. But at the same time, extinction is really unusual because it's catastrophe. It emphasizes disaster, and Joost and I wrote something about this on an open access thing called Open Democracy, which I think I put actually on your links, where we said, look, this is not how it's normally done. Normally you say, look, if we act now, we can live in a better world. Instead, they're saying, no, we're facing disaster. Disaster is probable. We should grieve for the losses of the natural world. And that's a deliberate, I think that's a case of what Lorenzo's talking about in terms of a deliberate attempt to create a different kind of an exceptionality.
Well, thanks a lot to Brian for the talk, to everyone for the discussion. And yeah, I think we are running a bit late, so we can go directly to lunch. Thanks again to everyone.
Thank you. No, thank you. Sorry that I went on so long, but I enjoyed it. Yeah. I enjoyed it too much. Thanks. Really good discussion, actually. I've got lots to think about. Actually, you've got those slides there if you want to. The only thing is, because it's got a video embedded in it, but if you want to circulate them to people, I'll leave them there. Yeah. Because there's 70 slides in that, but it's like other stuff. You know the way you create a PowerPoint?
Check, like you were still at 40.
I wasn't going to do 70. I was going to get to 49. There's about 30 hidden, but they can stay there. It doesn't matter. Thanks, Nicola. I met you in Manchester briefly, didn't we? Yeah.
No, but probably it's really...